Okay, then, this is the picture known as the Feast of the Gods, which is attributed to Giovanni Bellini, although Titian likely also worked on it as well. It was apparently originally intended for Alfonso d'Este's famous sister, Isabella d'Este Gonzaga in Mantua. Bellini was one of the artists she was trying to get to work for, but as I mentioned before, her domineering attitude put off many artists, including Bellini. In any case, in 1514, Alfonso bought the picture apparently from Bellini, since there's no record it was ever owned by Isabella. This was about the time Bellini was painting the Venus we saw earlier, and as I said, he was well over 80 then. In fact, it's widely believed that there is a self-portrait of him behind the fellow with the helmet, to the left of center there, and some think Alfonso and Lucrezia are the couple in the middle of the group. It's the kind of subject, purely secular and classical, which was becoming increasingly popular by this time, and which obviously appealed to the Este's taste because Titian was commissioned by them to paint several pictures of the same sort. Party pictures, as one critic has called them. In 1518, Titian painted the famous Bacchanal, which is now in the Prado for Alfonso. Kenneth Clark calls this the greatest celebration of drunkenness in the history of art. I think some of these people just should have said no a little sooner. On the piece of paper it says, if you stop drinking before you're drunk, you might as well not drink at all. Most great artists are versatile, but no great artist has been more at home with both the sacred and the profane than Titian. If you wanted the Assumption of the Virgin, he could paint it with as much spiritual intensity as if he'd been St. Luke himself. If you want naked substance abusers, he could paint them with as much conviction as if he'd been Bacchus himself. This is the picture called Bacchus and Ariadne, which he also painted for Alfonso, and which is now in the London National Gallery. Ariadne at the left has just been abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos, and seeing Bacchus accompanied by his retinue of snake charmers and satyrs waving body parts leap from his leopard-powered taxi there, she reacts with understandable alarm. Alfonso was delighted with the picture, though, even if it was delivered some 3 years after it was promised because of all the other work Titian had also taken on. And Alfonso now proceeded to load him with even more things to do, most of which he never finished. This is Titian's portrait, also in the London National Gallery, traditionally said to be of Ludovico Ariosto, who was born in Ferrara and became the greatest Italian poet of the 16th century. It's one of Titian's earliest pictures. It's also probably his earliest portrait, and it was apparently painted even before Sacred and Profane Love. The Italian Renaissance, if you put Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio in the Middle Ages, produces far fewer literary masterpieces than great paintings. In fact, the 15th century is almost entirely devoid of native Italian contributions in either literature or music that get any attention today from anyone but graduate students. In the 16th century, there's a bit more balance restored. Ariosto's plays, which were very popular in his day, are now considered, according to Will Durant, to rank high in the history of Italian comedy, though low in the history of European drama. But his masterpiece, Orlando Furioso, is one of the great literary works of the 16th century and had a big influence on European poetry and supplied subjects for painters and composers as well for a long time. It was written between 1505 and 1515, while Ariosto was having his bills paid by Alfonso's brother Ippolito. Here's the house in Ferrara where Ariosto lived. It's the one with the white posts in front. It has an inscription on it which reads something like, "This may not look like much, but it's mine and it's paid for." The poem is a gigantic fantasy, including everything from knights in shining armor to a trip to the moon, from the Crusades to submarines. Durant says it's about how boys chase girls until the girls catch them. Ippolito d'Este, the poem's sponsor, commented that Se non è vero, è ben trovato. If it's not true, it's still a good story. In 1530, Ariosto was enticed to Mantua by Isabella, who had him read at least most of the 35,000 lines of Orlando to her in this study in the palace. Isabella, who had been, as I said, anxious to have her portrait painted by some great artist and had been unable to persuade any to do her, finally talked Titian into a commitment about this time. The only thing was, she was by now around 60 and didn't want to be painted looking 60, so Titian agreed to take off a few years. And here in Vienna then, through the magic of artistic cosmetology, is Isabella at 60, looking about 30. It's worth pointing out that Titian almost never paints a portrait in profile. The profile was the standard format for the 15th century, while after Mona Lisa, the slightly oblique or three-quarter frontal format became state-of-the-art. I don't think I've mentioned her motto, which is a good one for a woman of her reputedly difficult character. It is forza che si, forza che no. That is to say, maybe I will and maybe I won't. This is Titian's picture called The Madonna with a Rabbit, now in the Louvre, which he apparently painted for Isabella and her husband Gianfrancesco Gonzaga in 1530, and it is thought that their son Federigo is playing the role of the shepherd in the back. The picture was meant to honor St. Catherine of Bologna, who was once a maidservant in the Este household. She's shown at the left, holding the baby Jesus, performing the same sort of service for the Holy Family that she performed for the Estes. There's some resemblance between the Virgin and Isabella d'Este as she looks in the portrait by Titian we just saw, but it is commonly thought that the Virgin is actually modeled on Titian's wife, Cecilia, who died the year the picture was painted. He never remarried. Here in the Prado is Titian's portrait of Federigo, the son of Isabella d'Este and Gianfrancesco Gonzaga, looking a good deal more elegant now. He was the fellow I suggested might be the shepherd in the last picture. He was unfortunately widely regarded as a coward because he did nothing to stop the invasion of Italy by Charles V in 1527. Charles raised him from Marquis to Duke of Mantua for this, something which his mother Isabella said was the greatest thing in her life. But I think you can tell from this picture that he was no real man. No real man would have a dog like that, would he? Actually, I don't know what Federigo could have done to stop the imperial army. Few did any more than he did to try, but taking the title did make it look like he was bought off. Now also in the Prado, here's a real man's dog with a real man. This is Titian's first portrait of the Emperor Charles V. It was painted in about 1532 after Charles's new duke, Federigo, whom we just saw, had introduced him to Titian. When Federigo suggested Titian should paint his portrait, Charles said he already had a portrait painter, Jakob Seisenegger. But Federigo told him that Titian was better than anybody, even Seisenegger as it were, and when Charles saw the result here, he agreed. Titian, he said, is the first man to paint me looking as impressive as I really am, or words to that effect. Just for the record, in the Vienna Art History Museum, this is now the unemployed Seisenegger's portrait of Charles, which the emperor himself gave to Titian to use as a model for his work, since he was too busy to sit for him in person. It's not such a bad picture, but the usual claim is that it is more like an illustration in a catalog rather than a work of art. Real art. While Charles could certainly recognize himself in Seisenegger's picture, it's easy to see why Titian was the guy he kept, making him a knight and proclaiming in fact that he would never be painted by anyone else. Titian then went on to paint the emperor many times, standing up as we just saw him, sitting down here in the Munich Alte Pinakothek. and in this most famous image of him, on horseback in the Prado again. This was painted in 1548 to commemorate Charles's victory over the disloyal Protestants led by John Frederick of Saxony at the Battle of Mulberg, where he thought he had beaten them once and for all, but that wasn't to be the case. The overcast sky is again important here, and I think this picture must have had an influence on Velázquez, who, as we'll see next year, spent his life in Spain and never painted a sunny day. This seems to me to be the picture which is the direct ancestor of Velázquez's equestrian portrait of Charles's great-grandson, Philip IV. This is Titian's portrait in the Uffizi Gallery of the feisty Francesco Maria della Rovere, the grandson of the old hook-nosed Duke of Urbino Federigo da Montefeltro and the nephew of Michelangelo's friend and nemesis Julius II. This is the fellow who kept badgering Michelangelo to finish Pope Julius's tomb, and who was forced out of Urbino for several years by the papal army after he killed a cardinal who was a friend of Pope Leo's. He married Federico Gonzaga's sister Eleonora. Charles V called him the only decent soldier in Italy, but he didn't do any more than his brother-in-law Federico to stop the imperial invasion, though no one called him a coward. In Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, which was written in Urbino during Francesco Maria's term of office, he is described as showing a greatness of spirit in every movement, but he was paying the author's bills. Also in the Uffizi, this is Titian's portrait of Francesco Maria's wife, Eleonora, the daughter of Isabella d'Este Gonzaga and Gianfrancesco. She was the sister, as I said a moment ago, of Federico Gonzaga, the elegant fellow I said didn't have a real man's dog, and it looks like they shared a taste for small dogs. In Il Cortegiano, Castiglione says that in her all virtues were combined. Although Castiglione wrote Il Cortegiano, the Book of the Courtier, during the reign of Francesco Maria, who was the nephew and heir of Duke Guidobaldo, the son of Federico da Montefeltro, the conversations which make up the content of the work are set in the days of Guidobaldo, in the early years of the 16th century. Here's a close-up of that little dog, and I think we'll see him again in a few minutes. This is Raphael's portrait of Baldassare Castiglione himself, now in the Louvre. He was the son of a count and was distantly related to the Gonzagas. When Cesare Borgia suddenly seized Urbino in 1502, Guidobaldo and his family barely managed to escape and lost much of their library and art collection. Castiglione, who was there at the time in Urbino, broke an ankle while nominally helping defend the place against Borgia. And when the latter fled to France the next year and Guidobaldo was able to return, Castiglione was allowed to recuperate as a guest of the Duke, and on the strength of his charm, he was able to stretch this convalescence out for 11 years, during which he wrote his magnum opus, Il Cortegiano. This is said to be the very room in the ducal palace where the conversations took place, but Castiglione certainly didn't just sit around taking notes like a stenographer. Some parts of the book may be at least based on actual conversations that took place somewhere, though, if not always in this very room, and he probably at least doesn't misrepresent the points of view of the various interlocutors, many of whom were very powerful and might have gotten mad at him. The book covers all the things a gentleman or lady should know about, and at which he or she should be skilled, in such a readable way that it's never been out of print in 500 years. The bottom line is that what the gentleman does must be characterized by sprezzatura and disinvoltura, nonchalance and easy grace. Everything must look easy and unforced. One must never appear worried or stressed out, whether playing chess, dancing, or dueling. In effect, Castiglione's ideal is the Renaissance man who can handle himself in any situation. This This is Titian's portrait of Cardinal Pietro Bembo, who is one of the chief actors in the book, sort of the Socrates of this academy, and who was regarded as one of the foremost writers of his day by his contemporaries, though I believe nothing he wrote is in print today. In his youth at Ferrara, he had a sort of poet's crush on Lucrezia Borgia, and in this century, a box of letters that had passed between them, which also contained a lock of her hair, was discovered. He did have a long, not-so-platonic relationship, however, with a woman named Donna Morosina, who bore him 3 illegitimate children, but it should be said that all this was before he became a priest and a cardinal, although even after that point in his career, he was regarded as the foremost authority in Italy on love, about which there's quite a bit of talk in Il Cortegiano. This is one of Titian's most famous pictures, the Venus of Urbino in the Uffizi Gallery. This is what the Duke of Urbino probably thought the ideal woman should at least look like. Just as the gentleman should never seem to be trying too hard, the ideal lady should never seem to be trying too hard to be beautiful. Too much makeup, jewelry, fine clothes, and all are counterproductive. Naturalness and graceful self-confidence are the real keys to beauty. This is the picture I mentioned earlier, which is usually said to have been influenced by the Dresden Venus, whether it was painted by Giorgione or Titian. Some do think Venus here is Eleonora, the Duke's wife. The face is certainly similar to hers, and isn't that her dog there? The picture was painted in the same year as the portrait of Eleonora we saw earlier, but it's very unlikely, considering her reputation for virtue, that she actually posed for it, though putting one face on another body is not an unheard of practice, then or now. Wherever Titian painted it, it is always considered to be evocative of, redolent with, the sort of sensual atmosphere of perfumed summer evening decadence that was thought to be representative of high-end life in the serene republic. There are, in fact, several other portraits by Titian which seem to have the same woman, a kind of idealized version of Eleonora, as their subject. This one, known as La Bella, is in the Vienna Art History Museum. This is another Bella, Laura Dianti, one of Alfonso's mistresses, it's thought. As I mentioned earlier, Titian is perhaps the greatest portrait painter of the Renaissance, if you consider the combined quantity and quality of his work. And we're going to see a few more of his portraits now while we hear You Can't Disguise Your True Nature, Mal in muta per affetto, by Marchetto Cara. This is a fellow known simply as the Englishman in the Pitti Palace. Castiglione says that black is the best color for a gentleman. This is Ranuccio Farnese, the grandson of Pope Paul III, whose portrait by Titian we'll see later. It's in the Washington National Gallery. This is a fellow named Vincenzo Mosti in the Pitti Palace. Bishop Beccadelli in the Uffizi. He was the papal nuncio or representative in Venice. An anonymous Knight of Malta. This is John Frederick of Saxony, who was the loser at the Battle of Mulberg, about which we heard earlier, in connection with Charles V's great victory over him and his Protestant army, which Titian commemorated with the equestrian portrait in the Prado. John Frederick was placed under house arrest in Augsburg, where Titian painted him on the occasion of his visit to the emperor there in 1548. He may have been under house arrest, but he wasn't put on bread and water, that's for sure. He was released 4 years later, although he had refused to give up his Lutheran views. And this fellow, another canvas-filling subject, is one of Titian's best friends, Pietro Aretino, now in the Pitti Palace. He was an important author and one of the most colorful characters of the day, being especially famous for his insults. One of the most famous was at the expense of Isabella d'Este, who he said was the only woman he knew to give birth after becoming senile. That reminds me of Will Durant's comment that she spoke Latin better than any woman of her day but never mastered it, which compliments her while insulting the whole rest of Italian womanhood. Aretino was once stabbed in the chest by someone he'd insulted, but he was so big the knife reached no vital organ and he survived. Ariosto refers to him in Orlando as Il Flagello dei Principi, the scourge of princes, and Castiglione calls him Unico Aretino, the one and only Aretino. When Aretino moved to Venice, where he spent most of the second half of his life, he lived in a house on the Grand Canal with this view of the Rialto Bridge, although the house itself is long gone. He mentions once seeing a whole bunch of drunken German tourists pile out of a tavern, jump into a gondola, and capsize the whole thing in the canal. On another occasion, he was sitting here with a friend when a beautiful woman walked by, upon which he stopped right in the middle of their conversation and followed her off toward the Rialto. His friend caught up with him and said, "Aretino, I think you'd sell your soul for that woman." To which he replied, "Yes, I would, but that's nothing. I'd sell my soul for a bag of pistachio nuts." He claimed to have insulted everyone he knew except God, whom he said he hadn't actually met yet. Not far from the Ferrari Church, you can see where Titian lived. This is the backyard of the building there now where Aretino says Titian threw parties. This is a self-portrait in Berlin by Titian at about the age of 60. He did about 6 or 7 self-portraits which survive, far more than any Italian artist before him. Despite all his traveling, he apparently did not visit Rome until he was about this age in 1545. He was given for his trip an escort of 7 men by Guidobaldo II, Francesco Maria della Rovere's son and heir, as Duke of Urbino, and traveled like an ambassador to be received by Pope Paul III as though he were a prince. This now in Naples is Titian's celebrated portrait of Pope Paul III with the 2 fellows who were officially his nephews, but actually his grandsons by his own acknowledged illegitimate son Pierluigi. We saw Titian's portrait of the brother Ranuccio earlier. Paul, whose name was Alessandro Farnese, had been known as the Petticoat Cardinal in his youth and rose to prominence in the church on the petticoats, as it were, of his sister, who was certainly much indulged by, if she was not the actual mistress of, Pope Alexander VI. Paul was 77 when this was painted, but he certainly has a sharp and foxy look about him, compared to his sort of drone-like and obsequious grandsons, or so it's usually said. The picture appears to be unfinished, and it is sometimes claimed that the grandsons stopped the work on it, not liking the way they came across, though I think this is probably not true. Alessandro is at the left, Ottavio at the right. The latter will be the father of the famous Duke of Parma we'll hear about next year. Paul himself is, of course, the fellow who commissioned The Last Judgment from Michelangelo, and Ottavio commissioned the Danae from Titian while he was in Rome. This is the version of that picture which Titian painted for Charles V's son, who was soon to become Philip II of Spain. The original Farnese version is in Naples. This is in the Prado. It depicts the Greek maiden Danae with Zeus arriving disguised as a shower of gold. Vasari was commissioned by Paul to show Titian around Rome, which interested him very much, and to introduce him to the other important artists there, including, of course, Michelangelo, who was 70 by this time himself. Vasari, in fact, brought Michelangelo to the studio in the Belvedere Palace, which had been given to Titian, and the latter was at work on the Farnese version of this picture at the time. Vasari says that while they were with Titian, Michelangelo was very polite and praised the work warmly. But when they were back outside, he said that it was a shame that in Venice they didn't learn to draw well. Here's a close-up of the picture. This is a very revealing comment, I think, because to most Florentine painters, and a fortiori Michelangelo, line was much more important than color. Michelangelo still really thought of painting as the filling in of a drawing, of an outline. Titian, on the other hand, used a different technique altogether, which emphasized realism at a distance, while producing a sort of blotchy imprecision, to Michelangelo's way of thinking anyway, up close like this. Palma Vecchio, another artist who visited Titian in his studio, said that he painted more with his fingers than his brushes, which would have appalled Michelangelo. But as great a painter as Michelangelo was, his technique was old-fashioned. Titian is the artistic ancestor of Rubens and Rembrandt, both of whom admired his work more than that of Michelangelo. Titian returned to Venice the next year, 1546, and it was after this that he made the trip to Augsburg to paint the equestrian portrait of Charles, which we saw earlier. After coming back to Venice again, he painted in 1554 the Adoration of the Trinity, or La Gloria as it is known in Spain, and sent it to Charles, who appears at the upper right center there wearing his burial shroud and accompanied by his wife Isabella, and on the far right his son, the future Philip II. When Charles abdicated in 1556, he took this with him to the monastery at Yuste, west of Madrid, where he spent his last years. The picture is usually considered to be a final, definitive statement of the emperor's Catholicism, since some radical Protestants denied the status Catholics assigned to the Trinity. However, if Charles had really wanted to make a Counter-Reformation statement, he could have done a better job than this. He could have put the Pope in heaven with the Trinity, which would have made the point much more obvious. I'm not really sure Luther would have found anything to complain about in this picture. Titian painted his last self-portrait when he was between 75 and 80, and you see it now. Vasari visited him in 1566, at about this point in his career, and says that he was still hard at work, but he implies that it might have been better for his long-term reputation if he had given up painting sooner. Many of Titian's last pictures, like those of Rembrandt, were of apparently uncommissioned biblical subjects, and were painted in a style that did not appeal to popular taste. This is Titian's Christ crowned with thorns in Munich. As I mentioned earlier, Vasari compared Titian's style favorably to the cold, linear, secca e cruda style of the 15th century, but this kind of thing was too much even for him. Here not only is there no line, there's almost no color. One of Titian's contemporaries who was very impressed by this, however, was Jacopo Robusti, known as Tintoretto and sometimes as Il Furioso because of his bold brushwork and the way he seemed to throw himself into his painting. One critic says that looking at a Tintoretto is sometimes like standing in a hurricane, and this picture certainly has some of that quality. Titian and Tintoretto had not always gotten along well, apparently, but Tintoretto very much wanted this picture and was either willed it or bought it from Titian's estate after the latter's death. This is perhaps Titian's very last picture, which he would have painted in his late 80s. It is, like Michelangelo's last work, at about the same age, a Pietà, in which the artist likely appears as Joseph of Arimathea. In this case, the fellow kneeling in red at the right. Titian traded it to the Church of the Frari, for which he had painted the Assumption more than a half a century before, in exchange for burial within the church, and the picture is now in the Academy Museum in Venice. Now this is the Scuola San Marco in Venice, which was built by Pietro Lombardo about 1500. Like other architecture we've seen by the Lombard school, it is another example of something that looks like it might have been put together by a committee, I think. And in fact, other architects were probably involved. In any case, G.E. Street singles this out as an example of the lowest depths to which architecture can sink. He especially disliked the trompe-l'oeil work on the lower facade, which makes it look as though there are passageways into the building there. There were 6 Scuole Grande in Renaissance Venice, including San Marco, and dozens of minor ones. The term scuola is difficult to define, but the Scuola Grande were essentially businessmen's confraternities with a religious and charitable purpose as well as a social one. About 1548, when he was in his late 20s, Tintoretto got his first big break here with a commission to paint a series of pictures now in the Venice Academy on the life of St. Mark, the patron of the Scuola. The fact that Tintoretto married the daughter of a prominent member of this Scuola suggests that connection is a source for the commission. This is the picture called The Intervention of San Marco, St. Mark, in which we see the saint as though flying into the scene from our side to rescue a fellow Christian from torture in one of the most dramatic tours de force of foreshortening that had yet been painted. Art historians put Tintoretto into the Mannerist category, and this kind of theatricality is a hallmark of the style, as is the emotional gesturing of the eyewitnesses. This is the rescue, sometimes called the theft of the body of San Marco, in the most nightmarish and eerie light ever seen in paint. His fellow Christians are taking the body of the saint to prevent it from being burned by pagans who are flitting away from the scene like scared ghosts before the red and black fury of the Lord. Another characteristic associated with the Mannerist style is, in fact, the use of bizarre, sometimes jarring color combinations like this. In 1564, Tintoretto began his monumental series of oil paintings for the Scuola Grande di San Rocco here, and unlike the San Marco pictures, these are still on the walls and ceiling of the building for which they were painted. Tintoretto was one of the most interestingly eccentric of Venetian artists, and one of the most famous stories about him concerns this commission. The essence of it is that instead of submitting a resume of plans and sketches like the other artists who wanted the job, he bribed the custodian to let him in so that he could paint a picture on the ceiling of one of the rooms, which he then had covered by a drape. And when he was being interviewed and the question of why he had submitted no preliminary studies here came up, he answered that he'd already begun the work and pulled the drape cord, revealing this picture of the saint all finished. He then offered to paint the whole rest of the ceiling at no charge. The other artists complained, but he got the job and went on to paint a total of some 56 paintings then over the next 20 years of his life. The masterpiece of the whole place is usually considered to be the colossal crucifixion on the wall of the Sala d'Albergo there. Vasari didn't like Tintoretto and said he treated art as a joke, but his biographies were published in 1550 before Tintoretto had done his most important work. Though Vasari could have seen the San Marco frescoes when he came to visit Titian in 1566, and some of the San Rocco pictures, if not this one, would have been finished by that time too. In the 19th century, John Ruskin said at the other extreme that this picture is above all praise. A distinction can be made between a crucifix, an icon that is, a painted or sculpted image of Jesus on the cross like those we saw early this quarter, which were hung above altars in churches and used as a focus of worship, and a crucifixion like this, which is rather a picture of the event and is not even in a chapel. This and Tintoretto's Paradise in the Doge's Palace, which we'll see shortly, are certainly two of the most impressive paintings of Christian subjects not in a liturgical setting. Now you see the Doge's Palace along with San Marco, formerly the chapel of it. Much of this building goes back to the 13th century, the Doge's Palace, but it was extensively rebuilt in the 14th, and since that time at least the look of the outer facade has been maintained, but two big 16th century fires, as I mentioned earlier, destroyed virtually all of the decoration of the state apartments, including virtually everything for which Titian was responsible. Palladio undertook much of the interior rebuilding after those fires, and Tintoretto and Veronese were among those who were commissioned to paint new pictures to decorate the walls and ceilings of those apartments. Here you see the entrance to the palace from the giant staircase, called the giant staircase because of the statues of Mars and Neptune at the top by Jacopo Sansovino, another close friend of Titian's. He's more important as an architect than as a sculptor, Sansovino, however, and built, among other things, the Libreria Vecchia across the Piazzetta to the west of the palace. In fact, Venice never did produce a sculptor who could rival the city's accomplishments in painting, music, and architecture, however. From the loggia at the top of the giant staircase, one then ascends the golden staircase, which you see here, also designed by Sansovino to reach the state apartments. And at the top of that staircase, one enters the so-called Room of the Four Doors. The entrance door is one, and then the other three lead to the antechamber of the college itself, and the Senate. The central ceiling painting here is Tintoretto's version of Jove giving dominion over the Adriatic to Venice. We'll continue this tour of the Doge's Palace now as it looks today and see some of the work that Tintoretto and others did in the late 16th century. And we're going to hear while we do this an intonazione for organ and brass by Giovanni Gabrieli. This is the hall of the college. Veronese painted the ceiling pictures, and the picture on the back wall depicting the Doge Sebastian Veneer giving thanks for the Christian victory of Lepanto over the Turks, an event we'll hear about next year. Tintoretto painted the pictures on either side of the clock to the right. They also show other Doges thanking heaven for similar favors granted. The college met here to prepare matters for debate by the Senate. consisted of 25 members chosen from the Grand Consiglio. This is the hall of the Senate, the 60 members of which made up something like the Venetian legislature. The ceiling paintings here are by Tintoretto, as is the Pietà on the back wall. This is now the Hall of the Grand Consiglio, which Juaner calls the most imposing room in Europe. Members of the Grand Council which met here chose from among their number those who would serve in the Senate College and on other councils, in agencies, on courts, and so on, and they chose the Doge himself. On the back wall is Tintoretto's Paradise, which he painted with the aid of his sons and his daughter. This is usually called the largest oil painting ever, at about 70 feet wide, and John Ruskin called it the most wonderful piece of pure, masterful, manly painting in the whole world. And here you see the center of it up closer, but most modern critics don't like it at all, considering it to be too slapdash in technique and diffuse in effect. Well, that's where we're going to have the sun set now in the Italian Renaissance. We'll be back to hear more about Italy next year, but in the fall we'll deal with the Northern Renaissance. Arrivederci.